Hello, and welcome to breakout session number 2, featuring here P. David Pearson and a discussion of the science of reading comprehension instruction. My name is Jay Campbell, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Assessment of Educational Progress Contracts at Educational Testing Service. It's a particular honor for me to introduce one of the most brilliant, prolific contributors to reading research, and one of the most compassionate and passionate advocates for student literacy development in our country. I've known David personally for more than 3 decades and have benefited greatly from many professional collaborations with him, particularly on the NAEP reading assessment, for which David has been a stalwart supporter and intellectual leader for nearly as long as the program has existed. He's left his mark in so many powerful ways on the nation's reading report card, to the point it's hard to imagine NAEP without David. Now, after David's presentation, I will be moderating a Q&A session. I'll take questions from the chat space, so please type your questions there. I do also want to mention that David has uploaded resources in the conference resource location for this session. There you will find links to several pieces, including the recent International Literacy Association piece that is the basis for today's presentation. So before handing it off to David, just a few more really important things about him. David is an emeritus faculty member in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, where he served as dean from 2001 to 2010. His current research focuses on literacy, history, and policy. With degrees from UC Berkeley, a BA in history, and Minnesota, a PhD in education, David's agenda in retirement focuses on historical and policy-oriented essays about reading processes and pedagogy. A member of the National Academy of Education and the Reading Hall of Fame, an AERA fellow and recipient of numerous awards, Professor Pearson started by teaching elementary school in California for several years before going on to complete his PhD in reading education. I should also note that he has been the recipient of several IES research grants over the years, including the IES-funded Reading for Understanding Initiative, which entirely focused on comprehension development, assessment, and pedagogy. As such, I can think of no one better equipped or prepared to speak to us today regarding the science of reading comprehension instruction. This session has been recorded, but at the end of the presentation, we will join you live, and I will facilitate the Q&A with David. And now, I'm pleased to turn this session over to my dear friend and colleague, P. David Pearson.
Good day, everyone. My name is David Pearson. I'm a retired professor of literacy and, in particular, reading education at UC Berkeley, where I've had a career-long interest in issues of teaching reading comprehension. Today, I'm pleased to be able to present our latest work on this. For the past 20 years, Nell Duke and I, with various colleagues, have been writing an update on reading comprehension about every decade, and this is the third in that series, and this time it's with Nell's colleague, Alessandra Ward. And I'm pleased to report that the article upon which this presentation today is based is available through the International Literacy Association and its journal, The Reading Teacher, as a free download. And you can just go on the ILA website and find The Reading Teacher and download it. I'm also pleased to suggest that the 2 predecessor papers that Nell and I, with others, have done will also be made available in the resource kit for this conference. And you can download those and look at how our views on reading comprehension have remained the same and changed both over time. Today, our treatment of reading comprehension instruction is different because we've called it the science of reading comprehension instruction. And that's consistent with the new context that surrounds most of our public discourse about reading. We've been blessed with the mantle of science most recently, and we talked about just about everything as the science of X or Y or Z. And we're taking that context seriously and trying to present to you what we know with a high degree of confidence from rigorous research about what works in helping kids become better comprehenders. It's already a contested term, however. People mean different things by the science of X or Y or Z. It is a debate that I think will last for a while, although I will say that the 2 issues of Reading Research Quarterly that have come out recently and have provided a lot of perspective on scientific ways of examining research and reading have been very, very helpful. If I could, I think it's useful to make an analogy with vaccine research, and we certainly know a lot about the science of vaccine research lately. Basically, there are 3 kinds of research. There's basic research about, the nature of viruses and how it is we can use information about their molecular structure, their DNA and their RNA, their genetic structure to now clone, through cloning, create vaccines and the like. But there's also clinical research where once we have vaccines developed, we go out and we actually try them out with people, and we do randomized control trials and try to determine their efficacy and the degree to which they're going to protect people both individually and collectively. And finally, there's what has come to be called translational research, or some people call it implementation science, where what we're concerned about is how we go about actually getting the vaccine into people's arms and the like. And of course, we're right in the middle of all that right now with issues of equity, who gets the vaccines, compliance, who resists it, regulatory and health environments and their variation by states, and then interaction effects with different kinds of individuals, and finally cost-benefit analysis of how much it pays to vaccinate what proportion of the population. By analogy, we have the same level of kinds of research with respect to reading. There is a science of the reading processes. It's traditionally been examined through eye movement studies going back over 100 years, but until I'd say the late 80s or early 90s, it was largely eye movement research. But lately, it's been fMRI research and looking at what parts of the brain light up when people do different kinds of reading activities and tasks and the like. That's one kind of science of reading. And then there's the science of reading instruction, which is all about, when we teach things in decoding, word recognition, comprehension in classrooms, what are the most efficacious approaches, and how does one approach compare to another approach and the like. And here we're really talking about doing experiments and quasi-experiments in schools and classrooms. And then finally, there's the new kid on the block, and that's what it comes to how you actually sustain effective pedagogy in school and district settings. This is called implementation science, and it's been championed recently by the Carnegie Foundation for the Study of Teaching, and it's all about how to create supporting and sustaining professional communities in which teachers can take the risks necessary to enact new research-based ideas that might challenge conventional practices that prevail in their settings. So today's presentation is going to focus squarely on the science of reading instruction, and we're going to deal with precisely those issues about how to be more effective in classroom settings and helping to facilitate and teach the kinds of processes, strategies, and information that kids need in order to become effective comprehension and to be able to read effectively on their own. To warm us up for this consideration of effective comprehension pedagogy, let's take a look at a typical text that a second or third grader might be expected to read in a school setting. This is from Not Just a Hole in the Ground, a book by Elizabeth McCarran. And here's the first paragraph with the diagram of the woodchuck's home, as you see. But then an introductory paragraph. Just take a look at the prose in that first paragraph. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost narrative-like. in its character, and you get almost like a little story about the dog and the woodchuck and the surprise and the escape and the like. But now take a look at the very next page in this. Notice the shift to this third, fourth, and fifth paragraphs. We get a completely different kind of text structure here. We went from a narrative into what do we have now? Almost a description of the home of the woodchuck and talking about, it's the purposes of various parts of it and the like. But the question I have for all of us is, what does it take to help kids develop the knowledge of content, knowledge of skills and strategies, and also the processes? What do they actually have to do in terms of processing in order to understand these texts? And we're going to review some things that I think will help us answer that very question in today's thing. But in our new conceptualization, we want to convince you that you want to bring a mindset of complementarity and synergy to teaching comprehension. Too often, especially when we want to convince others that a particular practice that we like has been underrepresented in curriculum and pedagogy, we fall into an either-or trap. Well, we're doing too much of that. Let's do less of that and more of that. So comprehension and word recognition become a kind of a zero-sum game, and we want to discourage that. We want to encourage instead a metaphor of complementarity, where we say, well, just because we're teaching word recognition doesn't mean that we can't teach comprehension, and just because we're focusing on building knowledge doesn't mean that we have to de-emphasize strategy instruction. That is, we look for synergies and friendships between these processes rather than any kind of substitution character. Also, we want to think of the various instructional components and activities as complementarity and integrated rather than completely separated and independent of one another. And one of the reasons that you develop fluency and one of the reasons that you engage in knowledge building is to increase kids' sense of self-efficacy, to enhance their motivation for engaging in maybe really challenging comprehension activities and the like. So think synergy and integration rather than substitution and separateness. And an alternative way of thinking about this, and one that Nell and Alessandra and I have tried to champion in this new article that we've just published in the Reading Teacher, is a layered model of effective comprehension instruction, where we think that, think of this as an archaeological dig into the pedagogical space in which we're working, and there are these different layers that we have to make sure are in place and working in coordination with other layers in order to help kids become really solid comprehenders. And we have, very general processes, like what we know works in a lot of classrooms, and that is, assessment instructional cycles, and, in this spirit of formative assessment, differentiated instruction, careful use of class time, relationship building, culturally sustaining pedagogy, all the things that we know about, and equitable instruction, of course, things that we know that work for math, science, reading, writing. Then we have motivational issues, and lots of things we can do to motivate literacy, build on interest, goal setting, choices, peer interaction, identity development, and a new thing we'll talk about later called comprehension, which is a term Nell has coined to describe what it is we want you to do with your comprehension once you've understood a text. That is, take some action based upon that. And of course, self-efficacy is involved in that too. All the things about language development, academic language, the language of particular disciplines like science or history, and then the way language is used in the world, pragmatic language, how words relate to one another, that's semantic knowledge, and of course, knowledge of how language works when we speak it and write it, syntax and the like. And all those aspects of language development influence comprehension. just as surely all the knowledge building and knowledge activating we do when we get you primed to read a text and the like are influential, as is engagement with text, that we don't just read things to build knowledge, we also read things to interact with others, to spark our interest in doing research and writing in response to reading. We also want you to read a lot. All those things that make reading more engaging have an impact on comprehension. And now we get down to the real nitty-gritty, teaching about text and teaching about comprehension strategies and routines and the like. These are the real stuff of reading comprehension, but without all the other layers, the general stuff, the motivation, the language, the knowledge building, these the teaching about comprehension processes and text structures isn't going to be effective. And all of this presupposes, and this is over to the side on the left, essential instruction in word reading and bridging skills, things like print awareness, phonological awareness, phonics, word recognition. This new thing on the block I'll talk about a little later called graphophonic semantic flexibility, which is a term that Nell and her colleague Kelly Cartwright have developed for a new kind of instruction that's pretty interesting. Teaching about morphology, teaching about fluency, all of those things influence comprehension. And we want you to think of each of these little tabs here as something that can be pulled out to benefit instruction for particular individuals or groups or maybe even a whole class. Okay, so think of these as existing as part of defining our curriculum, but a curriculum isn't just a curriculum for everyone. We want to have curriculum that are specialized too, so that if we have two individuals and we know that they're going to be different from one another, that those two individuals, in order to become good comprehenders, might need a little special help in one thing or another. So reader one here might need a little extra boost in motivational activities, and we might worry about how we can provide that. Reader number two may need some very technical knowledge about how text works, and we can provide something for that reader just as well. That leads us to the notion of differentiation, and here we favor differentiation based upon profiles of strength and need. And sometimes we can group by a common strength or need if, we want to emphasize a particular skill or strategy or body of knowledge. Sometimes we might group by complementary strengths or needs. So we pick you because you're a good summarizer, and you because you're a good writer, and you because you're a good questioner. And we put you together as a synergistic team. So that, kids work together on these kinds of things. We might also group you by interest, where one group is interested in the ecology, and another group is interested in, dinosaurs or something like that. And we also can group you by choices as well. We also know that we don't want to base grouping on just level or just ability, where you get into a group and you never get out of that group. You spend the rest of your grade level and maybe the rest of your school career in that particular group. So that's one thing we want to avoid. We want to make sure that grouping is flexible, that it's informed by that day-to-day formative assessment you do in classrooms, and so that you get in a group, but you don't necessarily stay there. We might move you there, and we might move you over there, depending upon what happens on a particular day or in a particular unit or something like that. So differentiation is going to be important here. And we no longer have to just guess about this. There have been some nice reviews, one last year in Review of Educational Research, which points out some of the very real benefits of different kinds of differentiated literacy instruction based upon assessments of students' needs and the like. Now I want to turn to the heart of the paper, which are the 9 key findings we have about from the research about reading comprehension instruction, and these are all found in our article, of course. The first one I want to deal with is to make it clear that we view word level and comprehension level emphases as complementary, not competitive. first thing we want to say is that when it comes to foundational reading skills, that meta-analysis after meta-analysis has concluded, even the National Reading Panel, even the National Early Literacy Panel, have concluded that foundational word reading skills are necessary, but they're not sufficient to guarantee comprehension. Instruction should be aimed at improving students' word reading. Phonemic awareness in phonics has a consistent effect on word reading skills and is less consistently effective on promoting reading comprehension. But there are studies and even reviews which suggest that there is an effect on reading comprehension. It just doesn't show up in all the studies. A new insight for me on the whole business of foundational skills came out of the Reading Research Quarterly Science of Reading issue, the one that came out in the fall of 2020. And that is the distinction between word reading skills, which is something that Linnea Airy, who has an article in that issue, has championed for years, and word-solving skills, which Donna Scanlon and Kim Anderson have a nice paper on in that 2020 issue. And what's interesting about it is that when it comes to word reading skills, we emphasize the phonics aspects of things, the letter sound version, developing good letter-by-letter decoding skills, developing word family decoding skills where we read words in like the AN family of Dan, Nan, Fan, and Van. And the goal of that kind of phonics instruction is to get you to the point where you build up a repertoire of words that you can recognize at sight without any arduous analysis. And this is not just irregularly spelled words, but also all the words that you can read by applying knowledge of letter-sound relationships and word family patterns. The whole goal is to get you to the point where you no longer have to analyze those words and you can just recognize them at sight. But there's also this repertoire of word-solving skills that Scanlon and Anderson write about. And these are very different because these are the skills you need when you hit a bump in the road. You get a word you can't read, you don't know what it says, you don't know what it means. And it's when you get to that point that you switch from automatic to intentional processing. And when students do, they marshal any and all resources available to them, including, of course, not just letter sound knowledge, but morphology, context, semantic and syntax, knowledge clues, anything that will help them figure out what the unknown words in says. That's word solving. Both are necessary for good decoding, fluent reading, and comprehension, and neither is sufficient for it. Well, we also have these bridging skills that we write about in the paper. And these are things like fluency, which is interesting because it both reflects and affects comprehension. That is, it's really hard to read something and assign prosody, intonation, and expression to a passage unless you've understood what it says. There's also morphological analysis, word parts, predictable word parts. And these are interesting because even a word that inside its root, like the word laugh, it has irregular letter-to-sound correspondences. The word laugh will remain stable in its pronunciation and meaning, whether it's in laugh, laughable, laughing, or laughed at. In other words, once you know that morpheme, it's pretty stable in terms of its pronunciation and, of course, meaning. And it assists with both word reading and, of course, in ascertaining the meanings of words. And then, if you look at the word woodchuck and then you see the word chuck later on, you can see an aspect of how that morphology plays out in the little article we started this with. And finally, there's this new kid on the block with this graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility, and this is the one that Nell and Kelly have championed recently. Think of words as having a semantic dimension and also a graphophonic dimension. And so if we get a word like brownies, which starts with the B, it is a kind of food, and we have a word like boat, which starts with B, but is a kind of transportation, and we have a word like pie, which starts with a P and a kind of food, then down here we need what? We need one that fits this. Well, it's got to be a kind of a transportation, but it's got to start with the letter P. And the only one I could come up with was putt-putt, but maybe you have, I guess Prius or Porsche would also fit there too. But this is a kind of flexible approach to solving our problems in which we invoke both meaning and decoding to solve problems. But just because kids are automatic decoders and fluent readers doesn't guarantee that they're going to be good reading comprehenders. People who've looked at this phenomenon have discovered that kids who are really good decoders don't necessarily end up being good comprehenders, implying, of course, that there's something more that needs to be taught besides just the decoding. You can't just do the code and then use whatever language skills you have to understand what you read. Some sort of emphasis on comprehension, either knowledge building or language building or strategy building, seem to be essential. We also know, and this is point number 3, that comprehension and instruction should begin early. You don't have to wait till kids are in the intermediate grades in order to start doing that. You don't have to follow the old adage that first you learn to read and then you read to learn. I think that it's pretty clear that kids need to read to learn from the beginning of schooling, and it's absolutely essential at every stage along the way. And a lot of this happens in read-alouds and conceptual vocabulary instruction, where you're just helping kids build up knowledge about how words work and fit together. And this results in a combination of language and knowledge development that is absolutely essential. As a matter of fact, there's some evidence to suggest that if you don't do this kind of emphasis on language and knowledge development in kindergarten and first grade, that if you just focus on the code, that by the time kids get in 3rd or 4th grade, those who haven't had any emphasis on language and knowledge will be behind those who have. The other thing is that you've got to teach comprehension monitoring early on, because comprehension monitoring is what allows us to avoid seeing a sentence like "I can GET a dog," and avoid saying "I can jet a dog," because when kids, if they just follow the letter sound correspondences, they'd probably go with get being mapped as jet. But with comprehension monitoring, get gets mapped as GET gets mapped as get. Monitoring can, in other words, block decoding overgeneralizations that we see so often in younger readers. So start comprehension instruction early. Teaching text structures and features fosters comprehension development. A lot of research on this. There's some recent meta-analyses on these two on this prospect, and the effects of text structure instruction appear to be pretty stable and pretty effective. And about a decade ago, Nell and I, along with Tim Shanahan, Joe Turgis, and a host of other colleagues, participated in a meta-analysis in which we looked at things that influence comprehension for kids in the primary grades. And we definitely found that text structure instruction was an effective practice for promoting this amongst primary grade children. On the next two slides, I've summarized the kinds of structures that we included in the 2010 IES practice guide on comprehension instruction in primary grades, and we found several structures. I think we found 5 that had been shown in research to be worth teaching. Description, that's what a lot of baskets of facts text for kids are about. Sequence, obviously the order in which things occur, and sequence is important not just because of the ordering of things, but the ordering usually has some meaning. That is, some things have to happen before other things can happen. There's this notion of enablement. Problem and solution is a common organization. As a matter of fact, most stories for little kids are about they encounter a series of problems and then they find solutions to each of the sub-problems and they solve the big problem. And so even narrative texts exhibit this kind of, or some of these kinds of organizations. Cause and effect structures are very common in science and in little history texts, and I'll tell you where they're really common is in texts that are about ecological issues, the environment issues. And then finally compare and contrast things and how things are alike and different. And we get a lot of these where you get a little book about, different kinds of plants that grow in the garden or different countries in the world and what their population is like, their major products are, the kind of government they have. You get a lot of these texts that could be organized almost as if they were at a table. But teaching about these structures just gives kids a leg up on recognizing how texts are organized when they encounter them in their reading programs, and that just makes comprehension all the easier. It's also the case that comprehension processes vary by what and why one is reading. When Nell and her colleague Roberts did an analysis of narrative and informational processing activities that students engage in, they found 18 distinct differences between narrative and informational text in terms of the types of processing promoted or required to understand them. There's also been some recent fMRI studies that have found different kinds of brain activity depending on the text structure you're reading, whether you're reading a narrative versus a kind of a descriptive informational text of one sort or another. And finally, purpose matters as well. It depends on why you're reading, what you're going to do with the information and the like, and whether you're supposed to use the information to solve something, evaluate the information, or just enjoy what it is you're doing. All those influence the kinds of processes that we engage in as readers, and it applies equally to 5-year-olds as it does to 65-year-olds. Another recent understanding is from both Dick and Nell here. In 2018, at a meeting I was at with several reading scholars, Dick Anderson got up and pronounced that the job of comprehension is not finished until the reader has done something with what has been understood. And I thought that was really prophetic because it basically said that just getting the meaning of what's on the page isn't sufficient. We read in order to learn things, and once we've learned them, we're supposed to do something with them. And this is what has led Nell to develop the term comprehension for the juxtaposition or connection of comprehension and action. Doing something with meaning that has been constructed, such as learn what you were interested in, be entertained, follow the steps to make something, critique an argument, to understand, and maybe even try to solve an issue in one's community. And, in this day and age when we have so many social justice issues to deal with in our country, it seems to me that this kind of disposition toward comprehension is all the more important than it ever has been before. In some effective approaches to curricular approaches like particularly project and problem-based learning approaches and some of the new integrated curricula, kids are expected to do something with their understanding of text as a matter of course, and I think that's a good move. Then there's vocabulary and knowledge building, and they support comprehension development as well, although the effects of vocabulary on comprehension are pretty local and we don't want to get too excited about those, but we know the following things: that even without instruction, that prior topical knowledge shapes reading comprehension of specific texts, and it shapes all kinds of understanding. The inferences to prior knowledge, but that's sensible. How could you draw an inference to prior knowledge without evoking prior knowledge? But it also influences text connecting inferences, where you hook up what happened in paragraph 2 with what happened in paragraph 3, as maybe what happened in 2 is the cause of what happened in 3. It influences those kinds of inferences. And it even knowledge influences even literal text explicit comprehension tasks, where you just have to sort of go find the part of the text that answers the question. So it's pretty involved in there. Priming topical knowledge. Remember, you're reading a text about photosynthesis today, or you're reading a text about how people solve their problems when they get crosswise with one another. Those can influence comprehension of specific texts as well. And thirdly, teaching relevant knowledge improves comprehension of specific texts. This one, there's very little evidence, by the way, that if we teach you the knowledge, it improves your comprehension of the text, but there's not much evidence that it transfers to general comprehension of other texts and topics. But there are a couple of studies that have done this, an old one by Gallagher and Pearson from the early 90s, and one by Sonia Cabell and her colleague Wang more recently, indicating some evidence of transfer of knowledge building to general comprehension of other topics. Comprehension strategy instruction improves reading comprehension. And this one's really important because here's where we often get the kind of the debate between, well, should you spend your time building knowledge or teaching strategies? The problem with strategy instruction is it's gotten a bad rap because it sometimes is very narrowly focused and it's short term. It improves comprehension. There's a lot of studies that show different kinds of strategies improve comprehension, and the meta-analyses on these are pretty consistent. Sometimes when comprehension instruction is long-term and involves clusters of strategies, like it does with transactional strategies instruction, these tend to involve more stable findings. When strategy instruction is combined with knowledge acquisition goals, strategy instruction has variable effects. Joanna Williams and her colleagues did a study several years ago where they found that strategy instruction improved comprehension transfer with no loss of learning of the content. In a science curriculum experiment with Zaretti and myself and several colleagues, we found that strategy instruction was associated with improved learning, but without a loss in comprehension transfer. And then comprehension approaches, I think, combination approaches rather, are probably easier to implement because they're consistent with the language curricular programs that we have in both subject matters and in some of our literacy programs. So integrating the two probably is what's called for. And here again, we want to avoid the false choices. Just because we teach strategies doesn't mean we shouldn't also emphasize knowledge building. And we can even do better than that. We can emphasize strategy instruction within systematic attempts to build knowledge. Well, let's go back to our layered model here. We have, the different layers. There's sort of general, what's good, effective classroom instruction. There are these things like motivation, language development, and knowledge building, and even engagement with text that are more or less ways of facilitating comprehension without teaching it directly. There's also over here on this side, the prerequisites are not, I wouldn't call them so much prerequisites, more co-requisites. And we teach these things, these word reading and bridging skills, not because they influence comprehension directly, but because they enable comprehension to occur. Once those things are under control, we can, as readers, devote much more of our attentional resources to puzzling over, figuring out, and critiquing the meaning that we're encountering. And then finally, there's this core set of things down here about teaching comprehension directly. And here I think we use things like a gradual release of responsibility model to enable kids to figure out what, if you will, comprehension problem-solving tools they have. These are the things you invoke when the going gets tough. Strategies, when you're reading stuff that you know a lot about, you don't need strategies. You just engage in what I call Nike reading. Just do it. It's when the going gets tough and you realize that you aren't understanding what you're reading that you have to switch from Nike reading to what I like to call Sherlock Holmes reading, where you have to go in and sort of see if you can figure out what's going on in the text you're reading. And you want to support engagement with text that fosters comprehension and development. We know that volume reading helps. We know that text discussion and analysis help. We know that writing supports reading, and there's pretty solid evidence for all of these kinds of synergies within fostering engagement. Project and problem-based learning help to set up more transparent purposes for reading, which also support engagement and motivation. And again, it's that synergy amongst all these different kinds of things that matters. We also know that instructional practices that kindle reading motivation improve comprehension. We know that motivation is largely driven by social context. We like hanging out with other people, and we try harder when we do. Motivation is shaped by choice. You give kids choice about what to read or what to write or how to represent themselves as learners, and their self-efficacy and their sense of agency improves. Motivation is shaped by curricular coherence. Kids are more likely to engage in a curriculum that makes sense, where they can see what's going on. And then a recent meta-analysis has shown some pretty substantial effects on reading literacy from things like attribution, teaching kids how to attribute their good performance to internal effort over external causes, interest-related factors. As a matter of fact, this meta-analysis on comprehension suggests that that it is an important sustaining activity. Well, summary. Instructional research has an important role in the science of reading. There are many well-supported understandings about reading comprehension and comprehension instruction. We've aimed to capture these understandings and avoid the false choices and the mischaracterizations through this layered model of reading where everything's of a piece. And we want to make sure that all the pieces of that puzzle called reading comprehension are supported. And you're not left with just this presentation. You'll find, speaking of coherence, a more coherent treatment of all these issues in this paper that Alessandra and Nell and I have just finished. So I want to thank you for being a part of this presentation today. And I look forward to the conversation that's going to follow immediately.
Well, thank you, David, for that comprehensive and discussion of comprehension instruction. I feel like I received a semester's worth of information from Professor Pearson in that presentation, and I thank you so much, and I'm sure our participants feel the same way. Questions can be submitted in the chat. We only have a few minutes, but can I kick us off with one, David? If strategy instruction is so well documented as a tool to promote comprehension, then why have so many prominent scholars and spokespeople, say like Beck and McCowan or Natalie Wexler and even Dan Willingham, criticized strategy instruction? And are strategies really worth teaching?
Well, it's certainly the case that strategy instruction has come under a serious scholarly scrutiny over the last decade, and in particular, I'd say over the last 4 or 5 years, corresponding to the rise in salience of the knowledge matters movement. Until this movement came along, I never thought there was any tension between, promoting a systematic knowledge growth in our school curricula and teaching strategies. For me, the issue was you have one set of tools that we, not one set of tools, one curricular activity supporting broad knowledge development in our science classes and our social studies classes, and making sure that we include knowledge about human relationships in our literature programs, but also enough informational text in our language arts program so that kids have some knowledge building going on there. And let's not forget, a lot of the information that becomes a part of our knowledge comes from the text we read. It's not the case that all knowledge has to be acquired experientially or through a lecture or anything like that. So one of the reasons that we want to promote strategies is that strategies, for me, are the tools you use when knowledge doesn't make comprehension happen almost automatically. I think of kids doing most of their reading of things that are familiar to them in an almost what I call the Nike approach, just do it. And what happens is that the knowledge you have allows you to do the monitoring you need to do in order to determine whether or not the text is making sense to you. Does it jive with what you know to be true about the world? That's your knowledge. And does it jive with what you read in the last 5 pages of the same text? So you monitor in terms of consistency and coherence with the text and consistency and coherence with your knowledge. But all of us have to read what I call Waterloo text that will bring you to your knees. Probably you took a stat course somewhere along the way. Those texts will bring you to your knees. And that's when you need to switch from automatic to intentional processing. And that's when strategies come in and are so important. And you sort of puzzle over the text and figure out how you can through some very close and systematic reading figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's why strategies are necessary for those things. But in a perfect world, kids will soon know so much about everything that they won't need any strategies. But until and unless they have that full universe of knowledge, I'm gonna hedge my bets and make sure that they have some tools for addressing the clunks of comprehension. Normally we want kids to have clicks of comprehension. You're just reading along and everything's smooth sailing. Every once in a while you meet a clunk, and when you meet one of those clunks, that's where strategies help.
That's great. Well, for me, reading a statistical test, my best strategy is to call a friend. Unfortunately, I have a lot of friends who are statisticians. We do have a question from Allison. David, does the transition from learning to read, reading to learn, does the transition from learning to read, reading to learn, the new have usefulness in terms of independent reading ability? I'm sorry if I'm misreading this. When people talk about reading to learn from early literacy, they usually illustrate via read alouds. So I think the question is, does the transition from learning to read to reading to learn have usefulness in terms of independent reading ability? Sorry.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
My interpretation of it is that that for little kids, you're learning to read, and you're listening to learn. But I also think that as quickly as you can, you want them to have learning goals for when they actually read texts, and particularly on their personal reading program, they're going to be reading about a lot of things that contain a lot of information, and we want to make sure that information doesn't go in one ear and out the other. So I think getting those early tools and processes moving along, even for early readers, is important. And by the way, I actually think that there's never a stage at which you're learning to read and not reading to learn. I think kids should always be reading and listening to learn in every text they encounter from age 6 months on. It's also the case that there's never a stage in which you're not learning to read. In that reading for understanding synthesis we looked at a lot of what was happening in middle and high school classrooms. And believe me, when you get to disciplinary reading, which we really start taking seriously in middle school and even more seriously in high school, you have to learn a whole bunch of new tricks of the trade in order to make sense of the text you're encountering in your science and history and civics classes and the like, and even in your literature classes, because you start to study literature from a more nuanced and a more intentional, almost literary criticism perspective, like what was the author trying to do here and things like that. So you're always adding to your toolkit, even when you're a really proficient reader.
Absolutely.
So I think that as long as we think that learning to read and reading to learn can be complementary and continuous, I have no problem with the distinction. I just don't think there's ever a stage at which you're only doing one or only doing the other.
That's really informative. That's a really good perspective. Really interesting and thought-provoking. David, we could go on and on and on. I know I'm sure everyone is enjoying this as much as I am, but we have to bring it to an end. We want to thank you so much. We want to remind folks that David has uploaded some information to the resource library. Please make sure to access it. And the ILA resource that he talked about as the basis for the presentation, I'm sure you're going to want to check out. And David, yes.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the resource section of this thing, I put back the 1992, the 2002, the 2011, and this 2021 attempt to review what we knew about comprehension instruction. So for those of you who are interested in history, you can look at that evolve over time.
Wow. Thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone for attending this really terrific session. And we want to remind you that if you can join us for the closing panel, there'll be a panel of experts that will discuss the causes, implications, and imperatives for closing achievement gaps. So thank you again for being part of this really important 2 days. David, thank you again very, very much. So long.